Today we are going to finally finish Kuftet Tzvav Halach Beis. The Ramah says, we're actually just going to read the Ramah. We're not going to talk much about what the Ramah says. The Ramah says, "V'imror asiyas hakvina v'leroha chaliva." What happens if a person saw the cheese making? So he knows that they made the cheese correctly, and so to speak, Gvinas Yisrael, but he didn't see that milk in the cows, so he doesn't know if it's Chol Yisrael. So then, yesh lahatir b'diavad, you could be matir the cheese b'diavad. Why? The concern of Chol Yisrael is maybe he mixed in treif milk, but of course he wouldn't have to be chayshish to that because he was planning on making cheese out of this milk. He was planning on making cheese out of this milk. It would be silly to take that milk and put in treif milk into it because it won't turn into cheese. So it has no meaning to him. And therefore, b'diavad, you could eat the cheese that was made out of that milk. So it was Gvinas Yisrael, but it wasn't Chol Yisrael, but you could eat it anyhow. But even though you're going to be eating the cheese, you're not allowed to eat the chol by itself. Okay, so we're not really going to talk about that, unfortunately. Okay, we're going to talk like this. We're going to talk about a bunch of things that are really have to do with making cheese. They're not really things that have so much to do with singing Kuftet Vav, per se, but they have to do with making cheese, and we're in our last halacha about making cheese, finishing about making cheese, so I'm going to mention these couple of things. And they are, when you take the cheese, we've said 100 times that you have the milk in a big vat, you put in the brine into it, and the curd, it's curd and whey separate from each other, and now you have your cheese floating around. When you do that, you drain out as much whey as you can, and then you pour this, whatever curd is left, and the curd that's there with a little bit of whey that's into it, you plop it onto what they call tables. These big long tables. This is the traditional way. There are fancier ways of doing it now, but you plop it onto this big table that has holes in it, and the cheese falls down to it, the whey drains out of it. They do stirring and mixing and cutting and all kinds of things, but what you're trying to do is get the whey out of that curd. So the obviously, if you're dealing with a cheese that's above Yatz Ledesboy, a kosher cheese or a treif cheese that was above Yatz Ledesboy, you have to deal with the kashering of that table. Okay, you just they plopped hot treif cheese onto it, and they plopped hot kosher cheese onto it. That would be that kind of a problem. And then after they finish on the tables, the cheese is then it's still moist, and it's still not in the blocks that we're used to seeing, like as consumers. What they do is they take the cheese, they put it into molds, and the idea of the mold is that it presses it into a certain shape, drains out the last bits of whey out of it, and gets it into a specific shape that they want to have it, usually round, getting to that shape that you want to have it, or squares, whatever you want to have it. And they sometimes use a cheesecloth that's in there. Okay, they wrap the cheese in a cheesecloth before they put it into the mold, and that helps it. As you press it tighter, the liquid can drain out of the cheesecloth, but not the solids. Those cheesecloths get reused, or could get reused. There are ones that the old way of doing it is they reuse them, and they would have to be kosher. We talked about that in Taftan Alpha Ches. They had to kosher those cheesecloths. Okay, for all those that remember. Okay, now on to more serious things, which is like this. In most cheese, when you, aside from putting in milk and the rennet that makes it separate, you add salt to it. Okay? You brine the cheese, and there's two ways of brining the cheese. For a second, I'll tell you, the salt has about, I think I counted 5 functions that I found as to what the salt's supposed to do. It draws all kinds of things out of the curd. It draws out whey and lactose and moisture, and it preserves it, and it adds flavor, like all kinds of things that are going on. There are all kinds of signs as to what's going on with why you're supposed to salt it. But for our purposes, there are 2 ways of salting cheese, and they are dry salting and brine salting. Okay? What does that mean? Dry salting means is when you dump the cheese onto the tables, they sprinkle salt over the cheese, and they leave it sitting on there. The last couple of minutes when it's on the tables, the range is like 10 to 30 minutes of the last while that it's on the tables. You sprinkle salt onto it. You mix the salt in with the cheese, and then it does what it has to do for the cheese, and then you move the cheese from there out. When you do brine salting, what you do is once the cheese comes out of the mold, or even if it's in the mold, but once the cheese is already molded and it's blocks of cheese, you dunk it into big baths of brine. It sits in those baths for hours or days or weeks. Okay, it sits for extended amounts of time in this bath full of brine. So before we go on to the questions that there are, I'm just going to throw in that brine is of course made up of water with huge amounts of salt. It's salt, almost like to the saturation point. There's as much salt as it can handle. But I never knew this before, so I'll mention it. They add other things into the brine besides the salt and water. And one that strikes us that's important is they want to add calcium into that brine because the salt will draw calcium out of the curd also. Among the other things, it would by itself it would draw out calcium, which will make the curd fall apart. Okay, the calcium plays some kind of a role in holding the curd together. So they want to add calcium into the brine to keep the salt from drawing too much calcium out of the curd. If it comes to some kind of equilibrium. So if you put more calcium into the brine, less calcium will be drawn out of the cheese, and calcium wouldn't be so bad. But an easy source then to get calcium to put into the brine is by dumping whey in. Okay, they'll put whey into the brine, not because they want whey in there, but because the whey provides calcium. So it's all over the place. There's whey all over the plant. They could drop whey, put whey into the brine as a calcium source to keep it from drawing too much calcium out of the cheese, which would ruin the cheese. Not just they don't want the calcium out, they don't want to ruin the cheese. Kosher, that's what I saw. That was news to me. I never heard of that before. So just something to think about. When they're making the brine, they make the brine in salt and water. That's the ikar of what it is. But there should just be alert that there's such a thing that people may put whey into it as a way of maintaining the right amount of calcium in the cheese. Okay, so we said there's two ways of salting the cheese. One is, and we'll do the dry salting one first. It's a little more straightforward. Again, the dry salting is they pour this salt over the cheese while it's on the tables. Now, the Ramah in Siman Kuf Hey talks about brining, dry salting of cheese. He talks about that, and the Ramah says, in the Ramah's day, what they did was, when the cheese was in its mold, they poured the salt on the din. Okay? In other words, it's like an in-between of what we do. We do either dry or brine salting, or both. Some companies will do both of them. But the Ramah did an in-between, which was, when it was in the mold, they poured dried salt on top of it. That's the implication you get from reading what the Ramah says. And the Ramah says you're not allowed to do that. In other words, you're not allowed to use a guy's mold when you brine when you salt the cheese. And the reason is because, why not? What's the problem? He says there's a din called Maliach Karizech. That's what it's looking at in Siman Kuf Hey, which is when things are in the process of being salted, they're in the process of being salted. That reaction, while it's being salted, makes it as if it's hot. It's not really hot. And just like when things are hot, they make blias instantly blias transfer. So too when things are maliach, they can make blias transfer instantly. And immediately you can't use the guy's mold. Unless you kasher it. You can't use the guy's mold to make your cheese because the blias that he has in the treif blias from when he made cheese are going to get into your kosher cheese. Okay?
That's all good. It's not international.
Okay, very good question. I'm getting to that in a second. Very good. So we're getting to that. So that's what the Ramah says. You're not allowed to use their molds. Now, the Ramah did his own l'chatchila because the din of Maliach Karizech, that's what the Ramah is talking about there. The din of Maliach Karizech is that Maliach Karizech can put tam from food into kalim, but it cannot draw tam out of kalim. It's a one-way street. It only puts from treif into a kli, but not from a kli into food. So the guy made the mold treif. When he salted his cheese, he put blia from the cheese into the mold. But when the yid's going to use it, no blia really is going to come out. The blia is not. It's Maliach Karizech, but it was a one-way blia. So now there's kosher blias going in. Who cares? There's no treif blias coming out from the mold into the food. But there are Rishonim who hold that Maliach works bidirectional. It works both ways, and therefore the Ramah says l'chatchila, you're not allowed to use the guy's molds, of course, unless you kasher it. You're not allowed to use their molds because you have to be choshesh that the Maliach Karizech makes time go in and out. Okay? Now, okay, so now, we don't do that. We don't salt cheese when it's in its mold. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody does it. The people who I asked, I asked a few people who no one does that we know nowadays that does that. But, as I said to you, they do salting on the tables. Okay, so the question is, should we be choshesh when they do the salting on the tables? Should we be choshesh for the same kind of chashash? Ramah says you're not allowed to use the guy's mold because of Maliach Karizech. So we don't do it in the mold, we do it on the table. So why should we say the same chashash? That the salting that you do on the table should also have the din of Maliach Karizech and say you can't use the guy's table for the salting, for that dry salting, because it makes blias go back and forth. Okay, so l'chatchila it for sure makes would make the blia go in, and we'd be choshesh l'chatchila that makes the blia come out also. So should we be concerned for that?
When you say dry, there's no liquid at all?
Right. Well, what it is that you've dumped the curd onto the table. The whey is draining out, so there is some liquid. I can't say there's no liquid. There is some liquid, but basically it's dry, and you hold it the last couple of minutes, so it's basically dry. But why would it make a difference if it would be liquid?
Dry? Totally dry?
No, it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. Mlich Yosef is more for dry things. Mlich Yosef is like when you're salting a piece of meat. You can't salt a piece of meat in a container because it makes blias transfer back and forth. This is not the blia that sear makes blias happen through kavlush. That takes a few minutes. We'll get to that soon. But that takes a few minutes for that to happen. That's a kavlush style blia. This is not kavlush style. This is like hot. It's kariseh. But hot means happens instantly.
Even still, there's a shear for Mlich Yosef.
What do you mean there's a share?
What do you mean there's a share?
What do you mean by that?
The time-wise. No, don't you have
No. What?
It's one of the
I don't remember how much it is. I don't remember how much it is. Is it big? I don't know.
If it's shaman, but we're not with everything is shaman, we're not fucking with shaman enough, so
I don't know.
at the end of the day.
And it's only geared for those places that do less than so it's
Well, yeah, that's most kosher cheeses are being done less than right. If it was yatzlan, it'd be kashering. But that's a pretty standard kosher cheese is less than yatzlan boy. Partially for that reason, because it's easier kashering parts. Okay, so the simple
metal?
Yeah. So the simple answer for why it's not a chashash is because of what David said, which is the din of Mlich Yosef only applies when you have something that's ein necha machma smolcha. It has to be so salted that it's inedible. It's so salty that you can't eat it. That's what that has a din of Mlich Yosef. Something with a small amount of salt, that's not considered Mlich Yosef. The question just is, and I think that's the correct answer. The question is that's what the Machaber says in Kufay, which is true. That's what the din is. The problem is that in Sim Tzadi Aleph, the Ramah says that we're not bekiyim to know what's considered ein nechlas machas malchut. We don't know how salty such a thing is considered, and therefore we're machmir that everything that's salted is considered has the din of Mlich Yosef.
What's this Ramah?
Tzadi Aleph halachei. So the Ramah says we treat everything like that it's ein nechlas machas malchut. So if you're going to say to me, so it's true in so to speak in truth, there's no blias. But why don't we say, the Ramah says we should be machmir that everything's ein nechlas machas malchut, so why don't we say the same thing here? Do you want to say something?
No.
Okay.
They rinse off the cheese afterwards.
No.
So
No.
obviously it's not.
Okay, so very good. No, that's correct. No, he's correct. So the Yehuda says in Tzadi Aleph, he says, even though the Ramah says that everything that's salted is considered in nechas machmas mochel, he says that even that has a limit to what you have to say to it. He says is gam ein lahachmer b'zeh machmer she'ein on the bikiyim. Don't say for everything in on the bikiyim. The b'zeh b'vad lo shayach bikiyas klal. When something is so not salty, we say it's like not even in range. In the sort of borderline cases, we're supposed to be machmer and consider it salted. But in this case, it's like taking it too far. He's not talking about our case. But in the case that he's talking about, so you would say that over here. The cheese, the salt is it's not being salted. It's sort of like an ingredient in the cheese. Okay? Cheese is salty. I mean, overall, cheese is a salty food, but potato chips are salty. But it's like an ingredient in the food. It's not being salted. So what you'd say is the Yehuda says we're not. This Ramah doesn't mean to say anything with a pinch of salt is considered Mlich Yosef. It has to be some kind of even borderline that you weren't sure if it's so salty, so you say, okay, it is salty. But if it's not even close, then you wouldn't say that. Okay, so to help you understand that, I looked in some numbers. Okay, I spoke to people for some numbers. Okay, the amount of salt that goes into cheese when you do this dry salting comes out to about 0.5%. We're talking weight, not really sure, but just contrast. By weight, it's about 0.5% of the cheese. So for 100 pounds of cheese, there's going to be 0.5 pound of salt. Okay, that's the numbers roughly how much it is. It's about 0.5% of salt when you're making the cheese. When you do melicha on meat, we do melicha on meat, which is that's the real thing. Is by melicha of meat, the salt the amount you use is about 4.5% salt by weight. Okay, when they do melicha on chicken and on lamb, it's as high as 9 to 14%, depending on who you ask. Okay, how much salt they use? The guy with the 14% told me he's overzealous. He uses much too much salt.
I need more for chickens than for.
Oh, very good question. Because they're smaller pieces, there's less surface area. You have to cover the surface. And chickens actually need more because they have a cavity. But it has more surface area. So you have a big side of beef, so you don't have to put salt all over the surfaces. But when you have pieces of lamb that are much smaller, you have to eat this salt all around. Anyhow, so what I'm trying to say to you is that the amount of salt is much more, 10 to 20 times as much salt in that as it is to this. How just perspective-wise to say is that this this is what even the Ramah wouldn't have been machmir for this
It's
case.
all in one place over there.
Say again.
It's all the meat and chicken. It's all in one place. You're making one service, and making one on Malia. It's distributed.
Right, you're right. So you're 100%. Which is when you make in the meat, it sits on the surface, as opposed to here, they immediately mix it in. After they sprinkle it on, they then blend it in because it's going to be part of the cheese. So they blend it in. You're right. So that's even more why it's like an ingredient. It's not being salted. It's being thrown in as another ingredient. That's true. Okay. One last thing to throw in is that.
When I realized this answer, it's not a
One
pick up brine once, coffee maker like one.
One last thing is that I'll just throw in when the Bali Shulchan speaks about this Ramah, who says that you should say we're always hush that things on Lich Kiraser. He says if there are other Stadim Lahakal, then you don't have to be machmir for this Ramah. But the Ramah says everything is ein nechas machmas mochoy. That's only as is. But if there are other Stadim Lahakal, you could be makel, and of course we have one over here. I remember I told you, the whole Ramah about the cheese mold is only lechatchila. Because me'ikar hadin, we hold, blias don't come out from the mold into the food. Or in our case, from the table into the food. So the whole din is a chumrah in the first place. We're being machmir to say is, blias should be choishish and blias come out of the kliyosah through mliach. So he's saying is, he's not talking in our case, but he's saying is, don't say the chumrah of everything is ein nechas machas malchay when the din itself you're being choishish is itself just a chumrah, which is in our case. We're being, to say blias come out is not minadin. Minadin blias don't come out of through mliach kirisech. When we go in, they don't come out. Okay, so the dry salting, the way we do it on the tables rather than the molds like the Ramah, we are not choishish for that Ramah. We talked about this one, halacha yud. The Ramah said something very similar, but we're not choishish for that, and we assume that there's no problems of mlich k'reseach when we do this dry salting. But the brine salting is much more serious. Okay, I count 4 issues with the brine salting. Okay, brine salting was, again, after you have the cheese in its molds, it's blocks of cheese. You put it into these containers where it sits in a liquid brine solution. I forgot to mention to you, the cheese floats in these solutions. So when the cheese floats, the cheeses that are sticking over, that like above the line, they pour salt on top of those. Okay, they do the dry salting for those because those pieces are like sticking out of the liquid. They put some salt on. Okay, so excuse me. Okay, so the simplest issue with the brines, with these liquid brining, is that the brine never spoils, and the brine gets reused. So if I make cheese today, when I pull all the cheeses out, I guess they filter it to make it a little cleaner, but tomorrow they use the same brine again. Okay, so the simplest issue is that if you're making brining a kosher cheese, you got to make sure that you have fresh brine or dedicated kosher brine. Call it what you want to. The brine that they would naturally use is the same brine that they used yesterday for treif cheese. Okay.
And I'm worried about flavor profile.
That's a good question. That's a Yossi question.
Some places pasteurize that brine. They check with the pasteurizer.
Really? Okay. You want some of it? I forgot about it. Okay, so now we have 5 things to worry about. Okay. The pasteurizer, I forgot about that. The pasteurizer, he's saying, you're saying pasteurizer, Yossi, als pathogens. But he's saying als tam. Are they worried about flavor being transferred?
Cleans it up. I don't know.
Okay, so it's a good question. I don't know. Okay. The next thing is, we saw, what I keep mentioning before, that he was hinting at, that there's a din of kavush that happens in less than 24 hours. One of the things that makes kavush in less than 24 hours is brine. And of course this qualifies. This is definitely salty enough to be brine. It amounts to the saturation point. So kvisha happens very quickly. So for example, when you make, in one place that we saw that was making string cheese, before the string cheese was cooked or stretched and put into this, what looks like string cheese, it sat in a brine tank it passed through a brine tank on its way. So that means to say is that it wasn't sitting, I'm not talking about a brine tank where it sat for 2 weeks. It sat there for a couple of minutes. It passed through a brine tank before it went on to the next part of making the cheese. So if you do that, you could potentially have this coverage of just a couple of minutes, between 6 and 18 minutes, depending on what sheet you hold like, but just a couple of minutes. So it's easy to get a problem of coverage in those kind of tanks. So usually you think if something is cold, you don't have problems. The cheese is cold, but even if the cheese is cold, it's not always. The string cheese punkt happens to be hot. But even if it's cold, you can have a problem of coverage in that tank, and that tank is not really built for kashering. It's a tank that's meant to hold cold brine. It's not really meant for kashering. So that then you also gets to figure out how to do that, how to deal with the kashering. It gets even worse. What's even worse for those tanks is the actual tanks that they do brining in within the same cheshire. The tanks that they do brining in the place that we saw, and we've heard of this before him, use cement tanks. Okay, maybe there's a reason why they use tanks that are made out of cement. Cement, of course, is cheres and can't be kasher. So not only do we have to kasher it, but it's not possible to kasher it. Okay, so to deal with that, to those places that use like cement, and even for other places where it's just too hard to kasher, what's common is that they use liners. Okay, they use what they call swimming pool liners. They just line the whole tank. So the tank is treif, but there's a line. It's like a big plastic bag is in there and the cheese sits. And the brine sit in the bag instead of it's like a chillum bag. It means you just put it around your crock pot. So you put this bag, basically a big bag, into your tank, and then the cheese is not sitting in the tank. It's only sitting in the bag.
We use fresh brine.
What did you say?
That was used fresh brine.
That was the first problem. We didn't solve that problem. Now we're talking about the kalim. Of course, it's clean brine, but they're not talking about the kalim because the kli has no contact with your cheese. Okay, but what Yossi noticed was when they did that was when they fill the brine, they put around the liner, they squirt in, 50 gallons of brine, and they dump in the cheese. Okay, what's going on? So it's a messy process with a lot of liquid all over the place. So what's going to happen is they're going to get liquid onto the wrong side of the liner. If they're not being super careful, they're going to end up getting liquid onto between the liner and the kli that was never kashered. So now there's going to be blias. So there's going to be blias now from the cement. The liquid is going to help bring the blias through the liner into the cheese. Well, there's liquid. So
but it's plastic. It's a kli.
Right. So, but there's a liquid in between. There's no blias go from kli to kli unless there's liquid in between them. And here there's a liquid.
That works with coverage also.
Yeah, what's the coverage? That's right.
Yes. It depends if it's stuff. Shaman, all kinds of with shaman, it don't work.
No, if you say good, it's good. Well, I mean, this chumrah of 18 minutes.
Yeah, it's going to happen always.
It's like I fish, you go to Kool-Aid, they go through Kalim. Kalim is just another thing there.
So Yossi what he told them was that they have to have double liners. Okay, they put on one liner in a nice, quiet, dry room, away from where all the liquid is. Then when they start filling it when they start using it, it's now a double liner. Okay, so the liner that's closer to the container, that's the one that prevents blias, and then the other liner is what holds the food. Okay.
It's only 50 gallons.
I made up a number. No,
It's huge. Just get a plastic bag, a kosher bag.
So some of them use plastic, but then they would have to be kosher also. They're not.
Just for kosher.
You could, if you wanted to, you could buy it. But there's money involved also, so it's okay. So next, when you brine cheese, it sits there for hours or days or weeks, and that means of course, that the cheese has got to be sealed up. Because you can't leave the cheese there in the company for 2 weeks while there's no mashgiach. It has to be sealed up. Okay, big deal. That's not a big deal to seal the room or seal the containers. The problem is that it's common that when something is brining for a long time, you have to move the cheeses while they're being brined. Okay, I'm not sure if it could just have to get the top and the bottom. I don't know what the reason why you have to move the cheeses, but that's pretty common that you have to move the cheeses around. So the simple way to solve it is tell them mashgiach to come back. Okay, so if twice a week they have to move the cheeses, mashgiach will come back, open it up, watch everybody move the cheeses, and seal it back up. That in a case that we dealt with was very expensive. Okay, they were out in the middle of no place. So Yossi put up cameras there. He put up cameras that were there after lots of shenanigans. He put up cameras over there so that he could always see what was going on. They recorded what was going on, and when they wanted to move the cheeses, they said to him, "Rabbi, we're going in tomorrow at 4 o'clock to move the cheeses," and he could watch it or not watch it, and he could see what was going on. Okay, so that was his control, so to speak. The room was, so to speak, not locked because he had a way to watch it. Okay, but now back to the fourth thing, which is what we started from, which was the din of malich karesech. Okay, the question is like this. So when the cheese is being brined in the liquid, we had said already, it's obvious that there's a problem. You have to kasher the kalim. It's sitting in the brine tank, and obviously the brine tank has to be kasher because it sits there with covers. After 6 or 18 minutes, it already had covers, so obviously you had to kasher that clean. But the shayla came up like this. This is also everything. This is all his story, his show over here. What happened was, when they finished brining the cheeses, they dumped all the cheeses back onto basically something that was like the tables that they use for draining out whey, but here instead of draining out whey, they were draining out the brine. Okay, they basically, in the same kind of a table, they dumped it onto the table, because now the solid cheese has to be separated from the liquid brine. It's sort of like separating curd from whey, the same idea. You just need something to drain it out on. So they put it onto this big table, they had holes in it, and they had a drain on the bottom, and they plopped it down on the table to drain it out. So the question was, should we say melech kareseach on that table also? It's the cheese is sitting in brine, and melech kareseach is right away. It doesn't have to sit there for 6 minutes. It's right away that there's a blia. So we should say is that the blia from the now minadin, we would say melech kareseach only takes blias from the cheese into the table. But the Ramah says that takes the blias out also. So that means yesterday they put treif cheese was dumped onto here, so we should be cautious that the kosher cheese has blias also.
So you can put a pickle on the tray table?
Say that again?
Can you take a pickle and put it onto the tray table?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. So that's one of the studying to be makel is that it could be that once the malicha process is over, there might not be malich. Just give me 1 second. Before I get to his southern, I just want to tell you this. I'm not going to go through the southern really. I'm just kidding. We're not going to really go through them. What it is that we chose. Rabbi Landa chose to be machmir, and we.
No, here it's not just a piece of cheese. We're talking about the pickle. Over here, it's not just the cheese. It's puddle of brine.
Right, with the brine.
It's sitting in brine. It's full of wet brine. Plop. A piece of the table, and it's puddle of brine that was there originally, and then slowly dried off. Mm-hmm. So if the brine really is there, and the brine gets straight to the table, then they can go to the cheese. There can be something
right. Cheese sitting in brine. 5 minutes ago, it was brining. Okay, so the brining is still going on, so to speak. Okay, as opposed to the pickle's pickled already from, yesterday. It's been pickled already. It happens to be, so to speak, by mistake in water now. Okay. So, they were machmir, and they lined the tables. He spoke to other people who hadn't thought exactly of the issue, but when he explained to them, chose to also be machmir also. So, it was simple. The simple thing is that it's correct that it is to be machmir. There are a couple of studim. To think that you should maybe not have to be machmir in those things. I'm not going to tell you what they are. But you should just know that every one of the things that came up of why you should maybe make each one of those things is something that the Ramah says, but we're machmir about that. Okay, each one of the Ramah says, even though the din is l'kula, but you shouldn't be makel about that. Okay, and that's sort of the tone you get about this whole din. The Ramah is saying is that there are all kinds of studim. It's really complicated, and it's really sophisticated. It's in like 4 different simanim in Shulchan Aruch. It's complicated, and therefore the meaning is to take all these things, to take it, the sort of the simple look at it and say is, all these things, it is malicha, you shouldn't do it, and therefore you should be machmir, which is correct, and that's what we ended up doing. Okay. Last thing is, in the packaging of cheese, there are 5 little things I'm going to mention to you. When you package cheese, okay, so far we haven't packaged cheese, so far we just made the cheese. 5 things in packaging of the cheese, and the first is that there's something that what we call American cheese, which is really, it's called processed cheese, which is they take the finished blocks of cheese, and they liquefy them. They cook them up till they turn liquidy. They add other ingredients to them, and then they re-solidify it into the blocks that you buy in the store. So after you cook that cooked cheese has other ingredients. Obviously, the ingredients make sure they're kosher, but there's also kelim issues when you're cooking up and re-solidifying those cheeses. It's being done hot, and it has to be kelim issues. Next, cheese can also, once it's finished, similar to be smoked. Okay, the smokehouses are not so complicated to kasher per se. The hot part of the kashering, the cleaning part of the kashering is the real mess, and that's the really difficult part. So smoking happens to cheese also has to be kashered. Next, the cheese, if you buy a block of cheese, you don't have to deal with what I'm about to say. But if you deal sliced cheese, the way they slice cheese, or even the blocks, the way they make it from a big 25-pound block into a 3-pound block is they don't cut it with a knife. They cut it with strings. Okay, is there a better word for than strings? Wires. Okay, thank you. Wires. And the wires are very thin wires pulled really tight, and they're really strong wires, and they just push the cheese through it. Okay, and the machine just pushes it through it, and just running through it cuts it. Okay, it just slices the cheese into slices or into blocks or whatever you have to do with it. Okay, so those knives, even though everything is cold at that point, but it's an example of duchad the sakina. Okay, that wire has the status of like a sakin, cutting through something that's relatively hard, and that knife, the official way to kasher it is through an itza, okay, which is to stick into the ground 10 times. Obviously, it's impossible. You can't stick wires into the ground. I mean, you could bury them, but you can't.
The only way is
wait a second. The traditional, the official way to kasher something that had maliach, that had duchad the sakina is through an itza. When we learned Taftanah Halacha Gimel, we talked about how you should really kasher. Okay, because obviously you can't do an itza then. Okay, we talked about how they should be kasher. Okay, you can go listen to that. Next, after you make your cheese and you're all ready to go, some people shrink wrap their cheese. their cheese. They put it into, basically what you do is you put the cheese into a plastic bag. I'm simplifying this. Put it into a plastic bag. You dunk the plastic bag into hot water, and that causes the plastic to shrink and to take on the shape of the cheese, and now it molds itself to the shape of the cheese, and then pops out. So it's in for 2 seconds into this hot water bath. It dunks in, the plastic shrinks, and pops out the other side. It's shrink wrapped right to its size. So there's probably a better word for than shrink wrap. But anyhow, it pops out the other side, and it's molds to that thing. Okay, there's quite a question as to whether you have to kasher those baths. The cheese going in just for a second. There's practical questions, there's halakha questions about whether you have to kasher those baths. I was going to talk about it, but as you see, we're out of time. So I knew that we were going to be out of time, and therefore you can just look at Sapirim 17. There's an article about it. Okay, and the last is, that's all I'm telling you. I'm almost done. The last is that there's a din in Siman Pei test that if cheese ages for more than 6 months, then it becomes a hard cheese. And after you eat that cheese, you have to wait 6 hours before you eat meat. Okay? And the generally accepted assumption is that 6 months of aging is real aging. It sits in a nice, dark warehouse in a cheese company, and it ages in the way they wanted to do it to develop the taste of the cheese. And as you do that, it hardens, and it gets a more pungent taste to it. And that's what the Shulchan, that's what the din is talking about over there, that you have to be the Ramah. It's talking about that you have to wait 6 hours after that. But you should just know that there are people who think that, no, as soon as the cheese is 6 months old, meaning from the day you drop them to rennet, if you count 6 months, and after that 6 months, you're ready, that's it, it's already considered a hard cheese. There are people who feel like, to the point that some of those people will say that's why it's a packaging issue. When they package it, they write the expiration date to be 6 months from that day. Okay. In other words, let's say the cheese can really last 18 months. But they're right, if today is October 1st, I don't know what it is exactly, it's October 1st, and they write, instead of writing October 1st, they write 6, I can't count 6, okay. If it was January 1st, they would write, the expiration date is June 1st, because that's in less than 6 months from now. What?
Really?
They would write that, because they don't want people to eat it and not realize you have to wait 6 hours, because no one would dream that it's a hard cheese. Obviously, no one would dream that. So they tell them to put the expiration date to be only 5.5 months from now, so no one will eat. They'll throw it out at that point. They won't eat like that. Okay, now that, as I said, is not generally accepted. If we ever do Siman Pei test, we'll talk about that question.